Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror.
We're constantly looking for those things we should be or think we should be afraid of that threaten us, threaten our status, threaten our group. And even if we perceive it as threatening, it may or may not actually be threatening. But, the famous aphorism in social sciences, if men or women perceive situations as real, they're real in their consequences. So to bring in a recent political example, there were no Haitians in Ohio eating pets, but many Americans believed that to be true, perceived that as a threat, and acted accordingly. And so in that sense, whether the fear and threat is real doesn't matter, but when Americans or humans perceive something as fearful and threatening, they're going to respond in really powerful ways.
That was sociologist Andrew Whitehead. Fear is a powerful experience and drives much of what we do. It is a signal to us that something dangerous is about to happen, but it is often a false alarm. Once activated, however, it can seem very real and become very hard to ignore. We can be manipulated by fear. Politicians motivate us by appealing to scary things, like stories of immigrants eating pets. It wasn't true, but then Trump and Vance used the story to scare people. Maybe it scared them enough to vote for them because those voters thought Trump and Vance could protect them. In any case, many analyses of Christian nationalism properly focus on bad history and political strategies. There's also a psychological and social component. That's what I want to look at with today's interview of Andrew Whitehead. What Andrew has to share has become even more relevant in light of the New York City mayor's race. Muslim Zohran Mamdani won the Democratic primary, which thrust his religion, race, and politics into the national spotlight. Immediately, Christian nationalists reacted negatively, saying Mamdani's victory demonstrated something bad about legal immigration. Mamdani's parents immigrated from Uganda when he was 7. I will come back to this at the end of the interview with Andrew, but it's clear that patriots who supported the Constitution in the late 18th century anticipated Muslims someday winning political office. Stay tuned to learn more about that. This is Warren Throckmorton, co-author with Michael Coulter of Getting Jefferson Right. Welcome to Telling Jefferson Lies. This season I want to do 2 things. First, I want to expose false information Christian nationalists use to advance their political goals. Second, I want to show why I think separation of church and state was the intention of the founders and the best arrangement for the United States today. Today's episode features an interview with sociologist Andrew Whitehead about his research into fear and Christian nationalism. I started by asking Andrew to talk about how people react to fear and threat. Then we got into some of his research.
Looking at human evolutionary responses, fear and threat are extremely powerful as responses to what are viewed as dangers in the world, right? So as humans are first and foremost kind of focused on survival, whether it's physical or in our present day, it might be more other ways we're trying to survive. But protecting ourselves, protecting our social group, we're constantly looking for those things we should be or think we should be afraid of that threaten us, threaten our status, threaten our group. And even if we perceive it as threatening, it may or may not actually be threatening. But, the famous aphorism in social sciences, if men or women perceive situations as real, they're real in their consequences. So to bring in a recent political example, there were no Haitians in Ohio eating pets, but many Americans believed that to be true, perceived that as a threat, and acted accordingly. And so in that sense, whether the fear and threat is real doesn't matter, but when Americans or humans perceive something as fearful and threatening, they're going to respond in really powerful ways.
Yeah. And in your recent research with Joseph Baker, you went into that some. You did some survey work and came up with some associations. Christian nationalism was a predictor. I wonder if you could go into that a little bit. What did you find in your research with Joseph Baker? And let me ask it this way. Americans who embrace Christian nationalism have fears that coalesce around two main things. What did you find?
Yeah, we found that there were two powerful constellations of fears in this survey research. And one is social fears about ethno-racial purity. So when we look at Christian nationalism, one of the key elements of it is this idea and desire for strong ethno-racial boundaries around who is a true American and what is America really like? What is the identity of America? And so we're able to identify that once we ask Americans about fears having to do with ethno-racial purity of the nation or the people group, it really comes out. And so essentially this is focused on xenophobia or fear of immigrants and refugees. So fear of people coming here who are not American, who might change what it means for America to be America. Fear of Islamophobia, and we know in research, Muslims and those of the Islamic faith are generally racialized as non-white. And so we see a really strong fear of Muslims and of Islam as a religion. And then also a direct fear of racial replacement. So when we asked Americans if they were afraid or how afraid they were of a future where white people no longer make up greater than 50% of the population, those Americans who strongly embrace Christian nationalism were more likely to be afraid of that future where whites are no longer a majority. So these were some of the measures of this idea of those who desire the U.S. to be a Christian nation have a particular sense of fear and threat about white people no longer being at the center of the culture, whether it's demographically, religiously, or socially.
I wrote down a sentence from the article. You said, Christian nationalism is one of the strongest predictors of feeling any sort of fear about a coming time when whites are no longer a majority in the United States. Now, to our listeners who are not social scientists, who don't talk like that, strongest predictors, they don't use that kind of terminology.
Yeah.
Can you translate that for us? What does that mean in terms of the everyday experience of people?
Yeah, so what we're trying to say there is that when we're trying to predict Americans' attitudes or fears in this sense toward whites being a racial minority, right? How afraid are they? We're trying to basically think of all the different things that could explain that. Christian nationalism is one, so we measure that in a particular way. So basically trying to understand the extent to which an American embraces this idea that the U.S. is and should be distinctively Christian and represent a particular expression of Christianity. But it could be that it isn't, how strongly they believe in Christian nationalism, but it could just be if they are a certain political party, right? So if they are Republican or Democrat, or it could be how often they attend church. Maybe that is the true explanatory variable, right, of how afraid they are. Or it could be their demographics. Maybe it's just because they're white, right? And if you're not white, you won't have that fear. And if you are, you do. And that could be it as well. But what we're able to do is to take all those things and look at them at the same time and see which one is actually doing the heavy lifting, right? Which one of those actually is explaining differences in fear. Because if we go to a supermarket, let's say, and talk to 10 people, we may get 4 or 5 who are kind of afraid. Maybe one is really afraid and a couple are not afraid at all of, a coming day when whites are no longer a majority. And it could be that, there are various differences among them that explain that. But what we're able to do with our surveys and our statistical analyses is to look at thousands of Americans all at once and look at all those differences across them and really pinpoint what are the differences that really do matter. So it isn't just necessarily how often they attend church, but what we find in our models, one of the real strong predictors is, again, their view of whether the U.S. should be a Christian nation. And so our goal is to say, hey, when we're trying to look at social fears and cultural fears in the U.S., one of the things we should look at is whether they believe the U.S. should be a Christian nation, that is really strongly associated with fears of social and cultural threat.
Yeah, and you say that that is the strongest predictor, the belief that America should be a Christian nation.
Yeah, for some of our models, it is one of or the strongest predictor. Across all of our models, it's among the top. There is one or two where being politically conservative is a stronger predictor. So if somebody says they're politically conservative, but for fear of immigrants, fear of Muslims, the Christian nationalism is the strongest predictor of having some of those fears. And so time and again, it isn't just necessarily someone's age or their race or where they live or how educated they are, or their income. It isn't just their religious tradition, where they attend church or how often. It isn't even just their political party or how politically conservative they are. What really kind of stands out is how strongly they believe the U.S. should be a Christian nation. And again, that really tells us a lot about what they're afraid of and where they see threat. We can't make any claims as to what is causing what. And I think there's a good case to be made that fear and sense of threat could cause people to become more Christian nationalists, right? To embrace that idea. And there is some psychological research, social psychologists are running some various experiments where they see once somebody's presented with this possible future of whites no longer being a majority, people tend to then more strongly embrace Christian nationalism. But I think, too, there's a case to be made that for folks that are in various religious communities where this idea of the U.S. as a Christian nation is really strong, I think that does tend to undergird this fear and sense of threat from anyone who doesn't also believe that, whether they think it's, people of different religion or coming from a different country. And so I think in many ways, a lot of this is reciprocal, right? These things are kind of bouncing back off of each other. And so in this research, what we're able to really show and identify is that whether the causal arrow points one way or the other, the truth is these things are really strongly linked. And in many cases, they probably are reinforcing one another.
But it's more than xenophobia and racial replacement. You also talked about fear of socialism and communism, globalism, and I really appreciated your historical perspective on that in the article that I read because you talked about the 1950s. So maybe you could share a little bit more about that. What else are people afraid of in your research?
Yeah, so, one of the things that we also found was not just fear of kind of ethno-racial outsiders or those types of groups, but also this fear of losing perceived autonomy and agency. So this really kind of gets at this strong undercurrent and theme within America and our history of individualism, right? The rugged individualists that came to these shores and made a country for himself in a lot of ways, covering over a lot of the other things that obviously took place historically here, but that's the theme and the idea. And so, what we find is that myth of American individualism and meritocracy, lives on in this, where folks are fearful of anything where they're told that this is going to take away your right to choose or you and your agency as an individual. So, drawing on the work of some great historians like Kevin Kruse, Kristen Dumais, and their recent books on essentially Christian nationalism, but religion throughout the 20th century and those effects. What we find is that, Christian nationalism is a thread that we can obviously take all the way back, even before the dawn of the United States, but especially in the 20th century. So with Kevin Kruse, he's looking at, the 1920s and fear of the New Deal and this idea of creeping socialism, and how it was really powerful capitalists that own newspapers and other really large corporations banded together to create this narrative of FDR and this New Deal is going to take away this Christian nation, and this idea that to be Christian, we need to be capitalists and individualists, and we shouldn't want the government, quote unquote, handing anything out, right? That is un-American. And so that was really powerful. And he draws this thread, and this book is One Nation Under God, by Kevin Kruse again. And he draws this thread into the 1950s, where now the fear is of communism and the Red Scare. And again, this idea of these atheist outsiders who are going to take everything that's yours and just take it to the state. And so this was the new fear. And again, in the 1950s is when we see "In God We Trust," being placed on our currency and in our Pledge of Allegiance, and those weren't by accident. And so that fear and sense of threat was cultivated on purpose towards a political end. And we see that again intertwined with this idea of that a Christian nation, those types of things, whether it's communism or socialism or globalism, should not be a part of what we're all about. And then, another measure of that was kind of more granular and on the ground is a fear of gun control. So again, the way that many Americans have kind of been told or taught this is that the right to own essentially now any gun you want is a true measure of American individualism and the fact that we are our own masters. And so any type of federal gun control restrictions, even background checks, now is interpreted as an infringement on this individualism. And so again, we find that Americans that embrace Christian nationalism, they're more likely to fear gun control, again, as this loss of autonomy and individualism that the federal government is infringing on their God-given right to do what they want, whenever they want, however they want. And so those are some of the measures that we look at. But again, we find this common thread and theme of this fear of individualism being taken away by the government or whoever, and that a real Christian nation should not fear or should be afraid of those things and should not have that taken away from them.
Freedom's taken away from white males, I guess, because, of course, there's not a lot of worry about taking freedoms away from other people.
Right. Yeah, when we look at the fear of ethno-racial outsiders, there's no qualms with rolling back, their rights to immigrate or accepting refugees or political asylum from those who fear their safety in their home country. There's no fear of those rights being taken away because, of course, for many Americans, that isn't their reality. But yeah, for some of these others, then of course the fear is very real.
I'm even thinking of voting rights. I mean, because that's a target for Republicans, at least, is to make that more difficult. You have a sentence in the piece that I'm keying on here. Christian nationalism supercharges these fears in a struggle between good and evil. And that seems like a very helpful way to bring in the Christianity part of this. Now, I'm just going to say something for you to react to here.
Yeah.
I certainly get that, but I wonder, and one of the things I'm asking every one of the people I interview is, why isn't Christianity enough for Christians who are caught up in Christian nationalism? They seem to need the nationalism. So we have these fears. Okay, you've outlined them impeccably. I mean, incredibly clearly. They are fears that are common to human beings. Despite our technological advances, you and I are different generations. I know them, you know them. But for Christian nationalist folks who are caught up in that, the Christian isn't enough. The by and by, or whatever it is about whatever brings you to Christ in Christianity, it's just not enough. I don't know if you have anything in your survey data or just in your opinion. I wonder why. Why isn't that enough?
No, I think about this a lot too, and I really appreciate the way that you're putting it, and wrote about this a little bit in my most recent book, where I'm trying to talk directly to Christians about Christian nationalism and to think through what is it about this where it is so desirable for so many American Christians that draws them, I think, away from expressions of the Christian faith that are are maybe not perfect, but are closer perhaps to this ideal of what we saw in Jesus's life and teachings. And I think about, why isn't it enough? And I think in the scriptures and the stories that are kind of there for us, looking at how humans have been thinking about themselves and God for centuries and millennia now, over and over, we see the same story where humans essentially failing that test of, is God enough, right? Is their creator enough for them? Or will they reach for more? Will they reach for those things that are not theirs? Or will they reach for power and control that they wish they had? Because again, they're afraid of losing status, losing their family, their tribe, their people, their wealth, all of those things. And only when we look at and interact with Jesus' life and ministry and those stories there do we see this example of one who shows us the way, a different way, because Jesus again was offered the riches of this world, right? And I, kind of write about this where when he was tempted in the desert, I think one of the key idols of Christian nationalism is power, right? The ability to get what you want despite the resistance of others. And so when Jesus was taken into the wilderness and tempted, we're told that, Satan says, I can give you all the kingdoms of this world. And right. So that kind of implies that Satan has the power to do that. But then Jesus says, no, he turns away from that power too. And we could imagine that Jesus as God and man and perfect would use that power really well, right? Would do a really good job with that power. And many Christians will make this case that, well, we need to get the right people in power because Christians can do it better than others. And Jesus, even if that had or was true, still turned it down, because I think what we're seeing or what we're shown in that moment is that Jesus, his life, his example, the life that we're supposed to take on is not about the ends necessarily and justifying those ends or the means we use to get to those ends, but it really is about the path, right? And setting aside that power over others to live alongside and sacrifice for others a different way of being in the world. And that's really difficult. It's uncomfortable. Nobody likes that. Nobody wants that. But it is a life of sacrifice. And so to circle back around to your original question, why isn't it enough? I think because it's too hard. It's just too difficult to think about not being able to get what I want or my group getting what we want. That is a scary proposition and difficult. And that's what Christians, I believe, are called to. And I think there are many expressions of the Christian faith here in the U.S. and globally that do walk that path. And so my hope is that more American Christians find those. But right now, there's a significant number that are not interested in that and are interested in putting the right people in power to get what we want when we want, and to say that this is our world, this is our country, and you either get in line or get out or get quiet, right? And so, yeah, it's a very powerful, tempting thing, this desire for power.
Am I cynical to think that maybe some of the folks that are in Christian nationalism leadership positions aren't really in it for the religion?
I don't think you're being cynical at all. I think, and this is really helpful too, where my colleague and comrade Sam Perry, he's written on this a bit, where kind of identifying Christian nationalism, it can be this kind of collection of beliefs, this constellation of beliefs, which is how we measure it a lot of times. But it's also this religio-political identity, right? It's just drawing these boundary lines of, this is my group. Whether you're personally religious or not, it's about, do I fit with this group? And then it also can operate as a political tool where it doesn't matter if you believe it or not, but if you're able to talk the talk, those words are going to resonate with people who are true believers. And I think for many folks, I personally think even with now President Trump, I don't know that he believes strongly in anything at all, but he is very adept at telling people what they want to hear and promising certain things and motivating folks. And so I think Christian nationalism and that rhetoric, he's seen that works, and it really resonates with a significant subset of the population. And so, yeah, I don't think you're being cynical at all. And I think for many folks in power, it's a clear avenue for a powerful political tool.
Yeah. Well, and it's a toxic stew then, isn't it? When you get the people are using it for political gain, and then you've got the true believers who really think that they need state power to get righteousness. I do think there are some of those people who are probably sincere in that view. That's, brings it over into some of the areas that I write about. I do think some of the history people are also using history, falsely, like the
Right.
Bartons and people like that.
Yeah.
But, some, they believe the Bartons, and I think they think that stuff's true.
Yeah.
But then you get back to the founders, a lot of them said, if your religion's got to have government support, it isn't much of a religion.
Right.
Like Madison and people like that. So, there's a nice dovetail of what they said and what you just said, about why the Christian part is actually enough. But I was also thinking about some other things that really incite riots in the minds of Christian nationalists, and I thought about gender stuff. Because it just floored me, it always has, about why drag queens just get these guys so upset. The Theobros,
Right.
And then it just, it occurs to me that deviance, that anything deviant scares people.
Yeah.
And I'm just so, I'm slow maybe, but I'm just coming around to anything that stimulates fear of change, and we're just in a period where I think Trump is just, the only thing he knows how to do is take advantage of that.
Yeah, I think I 100% agree. I think in times of social upheaval, whether it's demographic change, which we're undergoing, or more religious diversity, racial and ethnic diversity, when we're talking about gender and sexuality, greater levels of diversity, at least in the popular culture even, right? So it's still a small minority of folks who might be transgender or gay or lesbian or otherwise. But just again, as you're identifying this small minority that we should be afraid of, and then that gets lifted up and magnified. And the same with, almost any group. When we're looking at immigration, this is something that I wrote about a bit in my book too, because I think fear is, again, another of the idols alongside power within Christian nationalism. And, are there any immigrants in the U.S. that commit crime? Well, sure, yes. But when we look at the levels at which they commit crime compared to native-born Americans, immigrants in those communities are much safer. There's much less crime committed by immigrants than Native Americans who are born here, natural-born Americans. But lift up this one or two example and then just tell people you should be afraid of this, even though the statistics don't bear it out. So it really isn't about any sort of connection to reality in many ways, but just what can foment this unease and then how to capitalize on that. And so, whether it's gender, sexuality, or any other group, I think you're right that Trump has pushed on that and found that is the way that he can motivate folks to either stay home or vote for him. Because again, just like his first time in office, he won by very slim margins, but slim enough. And so here we are.
Here we are indeed. There is a lot that could generate fear. Roosevelt was correct. Many of us are afraid of being afraid, and so we look for someone to take away the fear. Sadly, at a high cost. Many Americans have allowed fear to bring them to trust someone who rarely tells the truth. Fear leads us to distrust those who seem different from us and trust those who are in our tribe, our in-group. That can only help Christian nationalists, and they thrive on it. At the beginning of this segment, I mentioned the election of Zohran Mamdani as the Democratic candidate for New York City mayor. Some influential white Christian nationalists are big mad about it. For instance, Trump's Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy and Homeland Security, Stephen Miller, said this in a post on X, quote, "The commentary about New York City Democrats nominating an anarchist socialist for mayor omits one point: how unchecked migration fundamentally remade the New York City electorate. Democrats change politics by changing voters. That's how you turn a city that defined U.S. dominance into what it is now," end quote. Well, the commentary doesn't lack it any longer. By the way, it appears that unchecked is code for non-white and non-Christian. Right-wing author Megan Basham added, quote, "Unchecked immigration led to a socialist Muslim mayor in London. Now it's leading to one in New York," end quote. Charlie Kirk chimed in with, quote, "The lesson from New York City is that both illegal and legal immigration can ruin your country. It's not just the open border. It's also our suicidal mass legal migration policies, bringing in over 1 million people a year, green cards, chain migration, refugee resettlement, anchor babies, and asylum scams. This all needs to be ended," end quote. This is just what Andrew spoke about in our interview. You can hear the fear in these postings. The thing is, Mamdani won an election. He isn't holding New York City hostage. He won an election. You know, the American way. And that's just what the founders thought might happen. Some of them, at least. They saw the possibility of Muslims and all sorts of non-Christians winning elections. After the Constitution was approved by the Constitutional Convention in September 1787, it went to the states for ratification. State legislatures appointed delegates to ratification conventions to decide the fate of the Constitution. In the state debates about the Constitution, the clause which said no religious test shall be required to hold office came up in several instances. Just to remind you, Article 6, Section 3 of the Constitution requires an oath of support for the Constitution and adds, quote, "But no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States," end quote. So this aroused concern in some state ratifying conventions. For instance, in North Carolina, Delegate and Baptist minister Henry Abbott was worried that pagans or Muslims might win political office in the new government. Abbott said on July 30th, 1788, quote, "The exclusion of religious tests is by many thought dangerous and impolitic. They suppose that if there be no religious test required, pagans, deists, and Mahometans might obtain offices among us, and that the Senate and representatives might all be pagans," end quote. By the way, Mahometans was the term at the time for Muslims. Constitution supporter and future Supreme Court Justice James Iredell responded to Henry Abbott, quote, "But it is objected that the people of America may perhaps choose representatives who have no religion at all, and that pagans and Mahometans may be admitted into offices. But how is it possible to exclude any set of men without taking away that principle of religious freedom which we ourselves so warmly contend for? This is the foundation on which persecution has been raised in every part of the world. The people in power were always right, and everybody else wrong. If you admit the least difference, the door to persecution is opened." End quote. So there is good reason to allow people of all religions to hold office. Stephen Miller, Megan Basham, and Charlie Kirk want to exclude a set of men, but James Iredell says it isn't possible to do that and remain the kind of nation we have always been. Iredell wasn't finished. He added that it was unlikely for Muslims to be elected unless one or both of two things happen. Listen again to James Iredell. Quote, "Those who are Mohammedans or any others who are not professors of the Christian religion can never be elected to the office of president or other high office but in one of two cases. First, if the people of America lay aside the Christian religion altogether, it may happen. Should this unfortunately take place, the people will choose such men as think as they do themselves. Another case is, if any persons of such descriptions should, notwithstanding their religion, acquire the confidence and esteem of the people of America by their good conduct and practice of virtue, they may be chosen." End quote. Like it or not, this is our system. Mamdani was elected. More Democrats liked him better than Cuomo. Elections aren't perfect, as we have seen. But that is our system, and it is just another example of the undemocratic nature of Christian nationalism for them to want to fix the system by eliminating all views but their own. Thanks for joining me to start the second half of the second season of Telling Jefferson Lies. A big thanks to Andrew Whitehead for his time and expertise. I also want to promote his book, American Idolatry: How Christian Nationalism Betrays the Gospel and Threatens the Church. I highly recommend it, especially if you are a Christian wrestling with Christian nationalism in some way. Speaking of Christian nationalism, I plan to focus on its limitations during the next few episodes and complete the season by examining the benefits of separation of church and state. The format will be more long-form interviews, and I've got some great ones coming up. I've been working on a book too, due out next year. It will fact-check Christian nationalist myths and folklore. I'm looking forward to being able to talk more about it. Music today was provided by Earl's Taco Shack, Dustin Blatnick, and Jonathan Swaim. Please tell a friend and leave us a great review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.